Tiffany. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Sandhya. Happy to be here.
So, to start things off, can you tell our audience a bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, so I'm Tiffany Smith. I'm the program manager for Vision Zero Network. I've been with the organization for a little over 2 years now. I do a lot of work around advancing income and racial equity in Vision Zero work. I work with both practitioners, Vision Zero practitioners on how they integrate equity in their Vision Zero action plans, but also with advocates, walk, bike, ped advocates across the country on how they can incorporate equity as part of their advocacy strategy, but also on sort of sharing communication strategies on how to talk about these issues in holistic ways. And my background, yeah, so I actually have a bit of a public health background. I initially sort of fell into roadway safety work. I was doing like sexual and reproductive health and justice work in New York City for a long time, but I've always been really passionate and interested in like public transit and safe mobility and transportation choices and options. And also just through sort of some personal experiences I've had with friends, sort of having some encounters with cars and vehicles, and thankfully they're okay. Just really recognized that the way our transportation systems are built are kind of like inherently unsafe. And so, sort of that experience kind of radicalized me, and joining Vision Zero Network was sort of the perfect marriage of sort of this like advocacy and public health interest that I had. And yeah, the rest is history. I've been with the organization and really enjoying it so far.
Amazing. Thank you. And I think that was a perfect transition because, as you know, we're here to talk about traffic safety. And you mentioned that you kind of came to grips with the fact that our
Hmm.
roads are inherently unsafe. And I think many people know that when they get in their car every day, that's one of the most dangerous things they might be doing.
Hmm.
So, can you talk through more from a public health perspective why traffic safety is such a critical public health problem in the US?
Yeah, definitely. So first, I just want to start by saying like traffic violence and traffic crashes, they really are a leading cause of preventable death in the United States. Just in 2023, more than 40,000 people were killed in crashes on our roadways. That's 112 people dying in a crash. That's like the size of a mid-sized airplane going down every day. So these are really huge numbers. But despite how often crashes occur within our communities and our country, um, these huge numbers are actually preventable. And despite this, our society sort of we've been conditioned to really accept these incidents as like sort of isolated tragedies, almost as accidents. And so for folks tuning in, I'm using air quotes, that can't really be avoided. But that's just not true. We've seen other nations, other high income nations they're far safer than the United States. According to the CDC, the US ranks worst, dead last among 28 other high income nations they assessed. And there are a few reasons for that, which we can go into a little bit more later in our conversation. But I think one critical thing around like the relationship between public health and transportation is just even beyond like the crash rate and the death rate. The public health impacts. Relate deeper to like even our quality of life. So, transportation in many ways is sort of thought of as like a means to an end, a point of a means from point A to point B, but within sort of this basic need to move around and go about our lives exists a myriad of sort of factors that influence our health and well-being. So decisions related to our transportation systems intersect with so many consequential aspects of our lives. Access to employment, access to education, physical activity, community connection, and even healthy food, nutritious food. And so as a result, really improving the safety of our transportation systems really also improves access to these critical destinations like healthcare, like employment. And I think just kind of on a public health sort of broader interconnected scale, but in and of itself, like having connected sidewalks and bikeways and a robust public transit system also improves physical health in our day-to-day lives. And so improving, roadway safety, the benefits are twofold.
Thank you again for that really comprehensive overview of some of the public health considerations of traffic safety and how it really impacts every aspect of our lives. I also want to touch on racial disparities in
Mhm.
traffic safety. You mentioned the kind of wide scope and high prevalence of traffic injuries kind of writ large
Mhm.
across the population. But are there certain communities that are particularly vulnerable to unsafe roads and
Mhm.
traffic injuries?
Yeah, so specifically, I mean, we're seeing that low-income communities, communities of color, are disproportionately killed in traffic crashes. Specifically, Black people are killed at more than twice the rate of white people on our roadways. And low-income and Black and Brown communities are also disproportionately sort of exposed to dangerously built environments with poorly designed, sort of high traffic, high speed roadways, often have a lack of sidewalks and bikeways, often have insufficient street level lighting. And this is, not random. This is directly related to a century's worth of policies like redlining, like federal highway expansion projects of the 1950s that really disrupted communities and incentivized planners to build extensive arterial road systems to kind of facilitate convenient access to suburban neighborhoods or really kind of speed people through these communities who don't live there. And so as a result of sort of the legacy of these decisions, oftentimes in the roadway safety world, we use a tool called a high injury network, and it basically maps where the highest concentrations of deaths and severe injuries are occurring. And we're seeing more and more that communities will layer their high injury network over some demographic data, specifically data on race. And they'll also see that these communities, like despite the high injury network really only comprising a small percentage of a community's total roadway network, these communities are like almost entirely kind of covered on the road up on the high entry roadway network. And so sort of seeing that, sort of the legacy of these past and present planning and engineering decisions. There's that. But then sort of at the same time, a lot of communities, in an effort to improve roadway safety, they may deploy enforcement and to kind of as a way to improve roadway safety. But these areas often need robust infrastructure improvements. So there's kind of this double whammy of both disproportionate like roadway safety risk and then potential for harm with interactions with law enforcement combined, which also creates this kind of unique sort of safety experience for Black and Brown communities.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate you bringing in the kind of historical legacy and the very active policy decisions that got us here, and kind of naming that this didn't just happen by chance.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned that your role is part of the Vision Zero network. Can
hmm
you tell us about what Vision Zero is and what role the network plays in advancing Vision Zero?
Yeah. So Vision Zero is an approach to roadway safety that is sort of underpinned by the safe system approach, but we can talk more about that later. But it's essentially a goal or that emphasizes that, traffic deaths are not inevitable. We have the tools to improve the state of roadway safety on our roads. And so it is essentially kind of there's a goal of a target year. It's grounded also in interdepartmental collaboration, a mayoral commitment to the goal, as well as sort of a commitment to data informed decision making around how to prioritize safety investments. And so we as an organization, we help um, communities, practitioners, planners, and engineers, as well as advocates, advance their goals of Vision Zero to really eliminate deaths and severe injuries on their roadways. And so we host a multitude of sort of like learning opportunities, webinars. We also develop resources and strategies. And we also, because there's a growing community of Vision Zero communities across the country, but we also host learning opportunities for those communities to learn from each other and glean best practices that they can sort of replicate in their own community. Along with, as I sort of highlighted earlier, we also do a lot of work with advocates on sort of educating them about the role of Vision Zero and how the status quo doesn't have to be what it is. Like you can advocate for these changes. There's more tools that can be used in your toolbox to improve roadway safety. So we're kind of working on both sides with both planners and engineers and also people who have been impacted.
Thank you. And you kind of hinted to this earlier, but you mentioned that the US kind of stands out in the ways in which we address road safety and also our kind of ranking as one of the worst countries when it comes to traffic injuries
hmm
and fatalities. So, to you, what do you see as the kind of major problems with our approach to traffic safety?
Yeah, great question. I think the current approach, or sort of like we like to deem it like the traditional approach to roadway safety, really almost overemphasizes education and enforcement strategies. Sort of kind of sending the message that sort of what needs to change most are the individuals using the roadway themselves, as opposed to kind of really looking at the root causes of these safety risks and crashes. And so, one thing we see a lot is like this sort of overemphasis of individual level solutions for systemic level problems. And one thing I also talk a lot about in our work is the most effective strategies are going to be those that are kind of far reaching and can like really impact communities on a larger scale, but they also don't require a lot of individual effort to be effective. And so one way to think about this in a like sort of public health context is like sort of clean water. You can of course educate somebody on how to use a water filter, but that requires a lot of effort. And they have to also buy the equipment. There's a barrier of entry to a certain degree. Or you can scale up water and sanitation system, a robust filtration system, the pipes, the drainage, connect the housing units, and everybody then has access to clean drinking water. And so to kind of highlight from like a roadway safety perspective, many interventions will say, people walking or biking need to wear bright clothing. And that, of course, can be a strategy, but the actual improvements to the built environment, like even fixing the street lighting so people walking and biking can be seen, adding dedicated space, a bike lane and or sidewalk so they're not directly sharing the road with someone using a car, reducing speeds on these roads so that the potential risk is also lower, and also just providing safe passages for people walking and biking in general. are going to be more effective than having one person wears a bright shirt or an outfit in order to be seen. It's also way more long lasting as well.
Thank you. And you kind of already got into some of the evidence-based
Mhm.
strategies that can improve roadway safety, like some of these infrastructure and design
Mhm.
changes, like sidewalks and better lighting and bike lanes. So, can you talk a little bit more about maybe tangible examples of these interventions being implemented? For example, is there a jurisdiction or multiple jurisdictions that have made some of these design and infrastructure changes and seen improvements in traffic safety?
Oh yeah. So we've seen communities even make small changes to reduce speeds, and that has been effective. Communities like Seattle, they lowered the posted speed limit on all of their roadways and found that average vehicle speeds decreased by 2 miles per hour, and injuries were reduced by 20%. In San Francisco, California, along with sort of the interventions I mentioned earlier, they also did speed humps and raised crosswalks and found an overall reduction in anywhere of 5 miles per hour to 14 miles per hour on observed speeds. And other communities like Boulder, Colorado, Atlanta, Boston, Minneapolis, and more have really seen improvements when they lower their posted speed limit to 20 miles per hour. Philadelphia, the city of Philadelphia scaled up robust traffic calming measures paired with very intentionally placed speed safety cameras and also observed a 50% reduction in traffic deaths. I know we'll talk about speed cameras later, but just wanted to share that example. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And I do want to touch on speed cameras, definitely. And I also really appreciate that it sounds like a lot of the interventions you just described are relatively low investment. Like, I think when people think about redesigning the roads, it inherently means like you have to tear up roads and completely rebuild them. But a lot of the examples you highlighted to me are like one policy changes, reducing speed limits doesn't require
Mhm.
any infrastructure investment. And two, things like raised crosswalks or speed humps can be just kind of added on to an existing infrastructure. Of course, that's not the most long term solution. Like some of this kind of
Mhm.
redesign of roads needs to happen for the long term, but a lot of the examples you highlighted could be done immediately.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, like, I think that the sort of crux is like even small reductions in speed have a really outsized impact. So, like, reducing the average speed by even 1 mile per hour is already associated with a 5% decrease in crashes. And so, I think the thing is, we know we have the tools to do it. We just need more political will to actually do it, and regardless of concerns about like traffic flow and those kinds of things, like really prioritizing safety over speed.
Great. Thank you. And given that your role specifically has this focus on equity when it comes to traffic safety, what does it look like to prioritize racial equity when implementing some of these interventions?
I've kind of grounded a lot of my work on the health equity sort of definition adopted by or developed by Dr. Camara Jones. She's a public health professor and researcher. And so our sort of, I guess, definition of racial equity within Vision Zero is you sort of valuing all community people and their mobility needs equally. So, sort of making sure the goal is that no one is invisible or underrepresented in transportation decisions and investments. It also includes recognizing and rectifying transportation decisions that may have exacerbated these disparities. So, in other words, really eliminating policies and or practices that either create barriers to movement or that have caused harm directly or indirectly. with movement, and really providing investments in safety policies and practices according to need and risk, as opposed to focusing on sort of community requests to make a much needed safety changes. So if you're looking at your data and you are seeing that Black and Brown communities are overrepresented in these deaths and severe injuries, that means providing resources and more resources in those communities to account for that disparity, so that as opposed to like sort of distributing resources equally across all communities. So really looking at where the majority of like communities who are showing up in deaths and severe injuries are, and really prioritizing investments there. I would also say, like beyond sort of our definition, one some of the ways I work with communities on this is establishing and nurturing relationships with communities that are most impacted. Not everybody has time to come to like a public forum or meeting, so going out and meeting those communities where they're at, gathering their input, and or compensating them for their experience and time, um, including a range of data in your analysis and how you prioritize your safety investments. Oftentimes, communities will use like sort of police crash data, but that often is it's not doesn't paint a full picture, and it also undercounts severe injuries. And we know that particularly for Black and Brown communities, and when you look at hospital data for crashes, they're like sort of overrepresented, even though in the crash data they're kind of underrepresented. So you need additional forms of data to kind of paint a clear and complete picture. And then I think just kind of like on a higher level, really shifting to this like safe system approach, really looking at the root causes for a particular safety problem, and implementing the sort of intervention that will be most effective for treating that safety problem, as opposed to educating or enforcing. And this is not to say that those tools can't be used whatsoever, but they're currently kind of being overused, particularly where many communities really need robust infrastructure investments.
Great, thank you. And I want to dig into the enforcement piece and
Yeah.
kind of what you talked about in terms of our over reliance on education and enforcement. So I
Hmm.
think on its face, police traffic enforcement has the goal of making roads safer. And that's
Hmm.
why we have armed officers that are kind of patrolling the roads to enforce traffic laws. What does the evidence and research tell us about the effectiveness of police traffic enforcement in achieving this kind of ostensible goal of making roads safer?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I'm also learning a lot about this as well. Not coming from like a criminal justice space, of course. Just being personally really interested, but like sort of looking at the relationship and really looking at the like legality has been really interesting. But I think one thing I wanted to note is like, I even assumed, I think many folks in the roadway safety space might even assume that traffic enforcement is being done with this like aim to improve traffic safety. But actually, a lot of officers really use their traffic stops for other purposes, like, to root out other possible crimes like drugs or guns or something. And so these pretext stops are really, often used to achieve ticket quotas or to search for evidence of criminal activity. And so, sort of contrary to this like belief, they're also not really either helping that much with their aim on that end. So we've seen like analysis has shown that traffic stops for really like low level non-safety infractions also like not only very rarely prevent or detect serious crime, It's like, I think for uncovering contraband, it's something like less than 1%. But on top of that, they're also not explicitly shown to have a clear correlation to improved roadway safety either. And so, kind of thinking specifically just about road safety, I think enforcement can be helpful if and when it's used in a way that is like data informed specifically to improve safety, specifically looking at like dangerous driving, dangerous speeding, or like impaired driving. Stops for things like a broken tail light, tinted windows, or like muffler noise are not impacting safety outcomes, even though a large portion of these stops are being done under the guise of safety. And so, I think in the roadway safety world, enforcement has been sort of shown to yield to some extent, particularly around like safe driving norms and compliance with seatbelt laws. It's been shown to be kind of effective there. And so I think as a result, it's just kind of viewed as this like status quo kind of tool or approach. But there's ample sort of evidence out there showing that it's not directly impacting roadway safety outcomes, nor is it necessarily the most effective tool at sort of crime fighting. And so there's not to mention the inequities sort of associated with this type of enforcement are also happening in communities that need robust infrastructure. I think this can kind of create a sort of cycle of over enforcement in areas that really would benefit from some non punitive upstream safety investments. And so, like, as I mentioned, I've really been really learning a lot from others, criminal justice and legal groups about sort of pretext stops overall. And I think the role of enforcement should ultimately be one like, if the goal is roadway safety, then it should be grounded in the data that we have. So if you're seeing that, like, dangerous speeding is a sort of top cause for concern, then you should be really focusing your enforcement efforts on the most dangerous speeding. I think, resources gleaned towards like low level stops also divert away from necessary activities to actually improve safety as well.
Thank you. Yeah, that was excellent. I want to follow through on that thread of like some level of enforcement is needed to keep our roads safe. And even when we talk about all of the design and infrastructure changes that are evidence based and particularly important, but even after doing that, for example, if we pass a policy to reduce the speed limit, we still need that speed limit to be enforced.
Mhm.
And I think communities and jurisdictions are now starting to think through whether, like if we take speeding, for example, whether that enforcement needs to be done by an armed police officer or whether it
Mhm.
could be done through some other mechanism.
Mhm.
We've seen some jurisdictions try to pilot a civilian traffic agency that could lead enforcement
Mhm.
for traffic laws. And then we're also seeing some jurisdictions try automated traffic enforcement. And you
Mhm.
mentioned speed cameras earlier. Could you talk a little bit about kind of what the evidence shows around automated enforcement and what are some kind of risks and benefits that we should be aware of when thinking about this as a replacement for police traffic enforcement?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that. I think I also just want to start off by clarifying. I think for us, I think the term of like automated enforcement is often used as like a catch all term for all types of automated enforcement and technologies like red light cameras, bus lane cameras, automated license plate readers, and speed safety cameras. So just want to clarify that when we at Vision Zero Network are talking about automated enforcement, we're really specifically talking about speed safety cameras, which have been shown to, I think, communities like Montgomery County, Maryland, Philadelphia, and mind you, a lot of these communities have also been scaling up robust infrastructure improvements, also New York City, simultaneously with the cameras that have been shown to reduce speeds anywhere from like 30 to 50%. And as you know, or for folks tuning in, like speeding is really like a critical factor in so much of like roadway safety risk. Unsafe speeds contribute to one third of traffic fatalities in the US. And so, in some ways, speed safety cameras kind of offer some advantages over police led stops for speeding because they're a more sort of predictable and consistent way of sort of enforcing a speed limit. They can be on 24/7 and be in more locations, and can be moved if, a traffic calming measure is showing to be effective on its own. It can be moved to another area that maybe can't have infrastructure design, or it's taking some time to do that. But it can also sort of free up officers' time to kind of focus on other community priorities, or lessen the chance for potentially dangerous or even violent encounters with police officers and drivers. That said, I think speed technology alone is will not improve roadway safety. It really does have to be paired with comprehensive street design, traffic calming, and lowered speed limits to really see the results. And plus, they just come with their own set of challenges. I think, for one, speeding tickets, whether issued by police officers or via a camera. These all sort of operate on flat fines, which are inherently regressive. We've learned so much from the Fines and Fees Justice Center. And so that can also reinforce harmful sort of poverty traps and income disparities. $100 ticket is going to impact a person who lives on a minimum wage salary very differently from a person earning $100,000 annually. So really have to think a little bit about, like, if the goal is behavior change, there's also evidence out there to suggest that higher fines don't necessarily correlate to improved behaviors on the road. So we've seen communities like New York City and Minneapolis's programs is just getting started. They have their fines capped at like $50, and there are many communities that are now exploring ways to have a non-pay option if they meet a certain income threshold. That said, recognizing that, again, like, there are communities that are over sort of disproportionately exposed to these like high speed, dangerously built roadways, um, wherever and whenever possible, like, design strategies really should be the first strategy, and or an interim strategy until more robust and comprehensive redesign and infrastructure changes can be made. And sort of recognizing also like this sort of kind of issue with speeds is like such a huge factor in roadway safety, but also recognizing that this sometimes takes a lot of time, like these roads that um, communities are working on. It's just going to take a long time for the changes to be kind of fully realized. We're seeing more and more communities roll out cameras as an alternative. And so recognizing, the kind of risk that this poses to low-income communities, communities of color, but also recognizing that communities are trying to address this issue of speeds, we developed a set of recommendations for communities that are choosing to use speed safety cameras, how they can do so in a way that is not disproportionately impacting low-income road users, and how they can sort of integrate like equity priorities in the development of their speed safety camera program. It's called Fair Warnings. I can share it with you all after, but yeah, just wanted to put it out there.
Thank you. That would be great. We'd love to link to it on our landing page. I just have one last question to wrap things up. For our listeners, what can the average person do to advocate for equitable traffic safety measures in their community?
Yeah. So one thing I think start with is sort of thinking about the language and framing about this issue. So one big thing I've told everyone in like my personal life, I've been totally radicalized by this work, is just like shifting your language from talking about car accidents, quote unquote, to car crashes. I think this is really critical in sort of emphasizing this idea that these are not like random acts of God or kind of isolated incidents that are totally out of our control. We do have the tools to improve roadway safety. And so I think language is really one key way to start by doing that. Others, looking in your community to see if there are already efforts underway to improve roadway safety, or whether there are walking, biking, pet groups, and sort of proactively approach them about any shared safety goals. I think one thing I've learned through this work is just like the coalition building with like criminal justice has been great. And I'm so surprised that it hasn't happened sooner. And so I think like, depending on where you are, what work you do, there might be a lot of like shared similarities or opportunities for collaboration with your local safe roadway safety group, whether it's like physical activity or racial justice or criminal justice, with jaywalking, all of that. There really are opportunities to align. And then, or maybe you're thinking about, improving community connection in a particular area of your neighborhood, slowing down speeds in that area could also contribute to that. So just wanted to kind of emphasize this idea of shared interests and goals. And then also, encouraging or engaging your local electeds to adopt Vision Zero in their community, and or participating in World Day of Remembrance for road traffic victims. It happens every year in November. This year it's on November 17th, and it really is about bringing a face to the numbers of crashes that happen on our roadways. Unfortunately, when someone dies in a car crash, it very rarely makes the news as opposed to like a plane crash, for instance. And so there really is like a large number of people out there who are being impacted by this every day. And it's rarely sort of talked about sort of outside of our community. So the World Day of Remembrance is also a really great way to engage and learn a bit more. And yeah, I think those are my calls to action.
That was incredible. Thank you. I really love that you touched on the piece about coalition building, and you mentioned like that you all have been building coalition with criminal justice folks. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, because I think one of the things that has really come up for us in this work is that it might seem that these two groups, like traffic safety advocates and criminal legal reform advocates, have different goals,
Mhm.
where like police stops of Black drivers is like a necessary bad in order to achieve this like
Mhm.
ultimate goal of traffic safety. But I think recognizing that actually these two groups have a shared goal of just improving public safety writ large. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of alignment in your work?
So, part of our mission is not only like eliminating deaths and severe injuries, but also increasing safe, healthy, and equitable mobility for all road users. And part of that is recognizing that there are segments of our community, like people who are at increased risk in a multitude of ways beyond just car crashes or being hit and killed, but also like via interactions with law enforcement. And so I think not only recognizing that as one piece, but also recognizing that there's a significant amount of resources and time and energy being not like kind of directed towards something that not only has associated harms, but it's also like directing necessary resources away from like what we know is the most effective and ultimately equitable solution and long lasting solution. I think that is what sort of has led us to really explore like are there ways to like really empower communities to think about this differently and to really focus on the design-based strategies? We've been using enforcement and education for over 100 years as a strategy, and it's not working. So if we want to kind of change the status quo, we've got to explore alternatives. And I think part of that is engaging with different advocacy or group or organizations like that maybe are working towards like a similar goal. And I think also one thing within like safety itself is like safety can mean a lot of things to different communities. There's like roadway safety, then there's public safety, and also just like feeling safe and how you move through your community. And I think, using that like knowledge to inform sort of how you build coalitions, I think you might realize you have way more in common than you initially thought. So that's sort of like how we've gotten into it, and as a result, we are also working on coming soon, but we've been collaborating with also criminal justice groups on alternatives to traditional sort of traffic stops in the roadway safety space, so that particularly geared towards like folks, advocates, planners, engineers that are like maybe not super hip to like criminal justice, but sort of framing it within that language of roadway safety, that steps that they can take to sort of foster all these alternatives. So when it's out, we'll be sharing. It's not out yet, but I just wanted to put that out there.
Amazing. Yes, please share it with us when it's out. And I think that was a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much. This was so excellent. Really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This was so great. I really enjoyed this conversation.